A while back, I had a crazy idea to message a few heavy hitting individuals in the retro gaming community, folks whose contributions shaped the very existence of what our parents played, we played, and our children now currently play as well. It all started with Mr. Ken Williams, the founder of Sierra Online, then Mr. Al Lowe, the designer for Leisure Suit Larry. After that, the floodgates opened. I talked to the voice of multiplayer god in Halo, Jeff Steitzer, and the amazing composer that crafted songs that defined my life, Grant Kirkhope. That left me with a hole though. Who would I talk to next? So I started looking at games I had played and it clicked. Why not Interplay? So I reached out to Rebecca Heineman, one of the founders of Interplay, and that's who I'll be talking to today. What's up, everybody? My name is Fortefyre, and today I have the luxury of sitting down with Miss Rebecca Ann Heineman, who you may know from Interplay, along with many other projects that she's worked on, some other companies that she's founded. How you doing today?
Quite well today. Thank you for having me on your show.
I appreciate it. It's always nice. I did, before we started talking, I kind of filled her in on what this is. This is a Legend series, and what we do is we talk to members of the industry, pillars of the industry, if you will, people who shaped and molded everything that we know and love from our favorite pastime, and that is the video game. Before we get started, I want to have an icebreaker. I wanted to ask, what is the greatest video game console ever, and why is it the Atari 2600?
Because it's the Atari 2600 and it had more cartridges until I think it was the Super Nintendo was the Nintendo 8-bit that finally took its crown. Um, but you know, for me, it was one of the foundational consoles that I ever worked on. And of course, if it wasn't for me winning the Atari 2600 Space Invaders tournament in 1980, I wouldn't be in this career right now.
Yeah, I found it interesting. I was doing some reading, and it seems that you winning that, and then some writing that you did on your own when you were much younger. I believe at the age of 16, you just up and left, and you went and entered this complete different frontier after reverse engineering an Atari 2600 game because were you just bored with what there was, or were you like, I could do this better?
No, I was poor. Um, I had friends who were buying the latest Atari 2600 cartridges. I couldn't. I didn't have money. But I did have a paper route and worked at J.C. Penney and stuff, making money so I can like survive. But I spent my money on this new addiction called an Apple II computer. And I bought one that kind of like the equivalent of falling off the truck, where it was very shady how I got it. But it's the only way I can afford it because back then the Apple IIs are like $1,200, $1,600 with things, and I got mine for 600 because I don't know. But with that, I figured out how through BBS's forbidden knowledge and things like that, how the cartridges worked. Yeah, and of course, back then, Radio Shack sold components, ICs, wire wrap tools, even Apple II prototyping boards. So I went to my local Radio Shack, got my latest hit of electronic doohickeys, went home, wired up some stuff until eventually I made first, it was an EEPROM reader that was able to read the cartridges. Then, in time, I then made an EEPROM emulator, which I plugged into my Atari 2600, and I got the games to run. And it was solely to copy the games. And I was able to amass a collection of every game ever made with the 5 finger discount.
Do you have any of those games still to this day? I see you have like an epic. I'm so jealous of that Vectrex that you have on the wall. That's the one thing I haven't. I've never actually seen one in person. A lot of people. So for anybody who doesn't know, the Vectrex it's a Milton Bradley product. They did two major consoles over the history of time. One was the Microvision. I own two of those. They don't work. And then the Vectrex that you see right next to Miss Rebecca's head. That is so cool. Vector graphics. Vector graphics.
You didn't even notice the fact I have a complete Fairchild collection next to it. There's a Fairchild Channel F below. There's some games from Boom Corporation for the VIC 20, which I worked on, there's only like a few thousand I've made. An Aquarius in a box I have with all the peripherals and everything. Up there, the 3DO Blaster, which people are like saying I will kill for that. But of course, Vectrex, because You know what? Vectrexes are awesome.
Yeah, and it's so hard to, as a streamer, that's not something that, unless you have a really advanced knowledge and nobody's figured it out yet, to output that signal to be captured on.
A long persistence camera. You need a camera that has 30 frames per second setting and that it has a long persistence receiver so that when it draws the entire screen, it can retain it and then you're able to see it. And it has to be synced to the 30 hertz frequency so then it doesn't flash. That's how you do it. Because unfortunately, it's using a visual technology that it can't be recorded.
No, no, it's that's a crown jewel of some people's collection. So, man, props to you. Did you ever expect to be one of the best Space Invaders players of all time?
No, no. In fact, I was convinced that I was one of the worst. And when my friend insisted that I enter this contest saying that I will win, I did not believe him. And when I went and played, I wasn't even putting in my all. I was kind of phoning it in because I thought, okay, I'll play the game. Yeah, it's boring, blah, blah, blah. After an hour of play, the aliens land on me because I was distracted. And that was the only reason I stopped playing. And when the guy said my score was 88,000, my first reaction was, is that good?
Good, you
Only to
won.
be told that it was the highest score they've ever seen. And it's like, well, okay. And that's what made me win the Los Angeles Regional.
You're one of the first. I believe you are the first ever video game tournament champion.
It was the first ever nationally sponsored video game tournament. I know there was tournaments that were done like in colleges, like an MIT Space War thing, but it was only like on a college campus, like with only in that little area, in which they were giving out small prizes like $10. But the Atari 2600 was the very first contest that was actually run, let's say, nationwide with advertising, corporate sponsors, and it was a big deal. And I was the one who phoned it in at the regional, but I brought my A game when it came to the finals.
That's awesome. So, what happened after that? After that championship, whenever you eventually met the people in charge of Avalon Hill.
Well, that happened later. When I was at the contest, I met up with Bill Katz, I was like Arnie Katz, Bill Kunkel, Joyce Worley. Those are the three who created Electronic Games Magazine, which at the time was the biggest video game magazine there. Because, they were all covering ColecoVision. Actually, at the time it was Intellivision and Atari. Coleco came 2 years later. But they, actually it was a year later, but they were just talking about the latest cartridges, all the new companies jumping in, making Atari cartridges and so forth. And they said, well, since you're a video game champion, we will hook you up with this guy who will ghostwrite for you to write 2 books on how to beat the video games. So there's 2 books out there called How to Beat the Video Games and How to Beat the Home Video Games. And I was the one who gave all the specifics and information, saying this is all the strategies. And he then, Tom Herschel, I think his name was, actually wrote the books, but I was the one who, so it's like ghost written for me. Because I was a 16-year-old kid, and it's not like I knew how to do that.
But you could do
But
everything else.
well, just because one is great playing video games doesn't necessarily mean that you're great about writing about video games. Now I've earned those skills and so forth, but at that time in my life, no, I wasn't going to be winning any Pulitzer prizes for anything I wrote. But after I wrote those 2 books, then I started writing articles for the Electronic Games Magazine about basically how to beat video games, blah, 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 blah. But in time, I then told them, hey, I've been copying Atari cartridges. And of course, they're going, is that even possible? I said, yeah. And then while I'm doing it, I reverse engineered a couple of cartridges. Now I'm making my own. And they're like, right now, all these video game companies are sprouting up. But their biggest problem was in that time, Atari never allowed anyone to develop cartridges officially for the Atari 2600. So everybody who made games was doing it through reverse engineering, which they took cartridges, disassembled them, learned how they work, and then made their own games based on what they learned. So Avalon Hill at the time wanted to join the big fray of making Atari 2600 games. So when they were informed by my publishers at Electronic Games Magazine that there was some crazy chick on the West Coast who reverse engineered and made her own carts, they said, "We want to hire this person." And they hired me over the phone. And like a few days later, I was in Towson, Maryland, building Atari 2600 dev kits based on my original design. Um, and then teaching their programmers how to make 2600 games.
That's the golden
That,
path
that
of,
was my first programming job where I actually earned money.
and it's true that you just up and left. You're like, yeah, let's do this. Cowabunga, it is.
Yeah, well, considering I was totally estranged from my family, it was like,
Yeah,
sure, why not?
something different, change of pace. So
And
Avalon,
also
there was
get
a
away from my
game
family.
created under the tenure of Avalon Hill. It's known as London Blitz.
Yeah, there was London Blitz and Out of Control, two that I'm directly responsible for, but there were 5 games total. And all of them only exist because of the dev kits I created and all the information, the programmer's Bible I gave to Avalon Hill. If those dev kits and the Bible didn't exist, those cartridges would never exist.
So I guess the question is, because London Blitz is credited to William, I think it's J. Shepard, William
Yeah,
Shepard.
Luke Shepard.
So everything that they were capable of doing solely existed because of your expertise and this newfound interest.
Yes.
That's incredible.
Yeah,
It's so cool.
had I not been hired, I have absolutely no idea who they would have brought on. And I would assure you that at the time, anybody who knew Atari 2600 programming could basically name their price. And I was just a kid who was more interested in teaching everybody. So when I first worked at Avalon Hill, I'm kid you not, I was making only $500 a month. That was it, because I didn't know what it was worth. So they're like, "Hey, we could pay $100,000 to get an Atari employee to leave Atari and work for us, or we could pay this kid $500, and she's like working 20-hour days, only sleeping, just because she's tired, and wakes up and immediately starts working on dev kits again." So the hard decision. Yeah.
Yeah, that was. I mean, I guess at the time, because yeah, and you mentioned that Atari was kind of like, no, this is ours. Nobody can really have an identity, and that's actually something that a lot of people complain about, at least former Atari employees. I think I had a brief conversation with David Crane, and that was one of the big things that they mentioned is that Atari would put out this periodical inside of I don't know how to. It's not really an expense report or maybe an annual report of some of the best work that they've done, the sales figures associated with it, but they never said, "Hey, this is who created this." And everybody, looked around the room and they were like, "We can do this on our own." Larry
Well,
Kaplan, Bob Whitehead, all of those guys got together and Activision was made. And that, the creation of Activision was a huge step forward in creating the whole identity of the third party developer. So mad props to them.
Oh yeah, the Activision created the concept of a third party developer. And one has to remember of the time, which also reflects to even today. Like, if you go to a Toyota dealership and you see the latest Camry, do you ever find out who designed it? Because it's made by Toyota. That has been the corporate mindset since the beginning of time. And there was no reason for Atari, when they were developing the games for the Atari 2600, is that a group of people came with the Atari 2600 design, but it was an Atari product. So that it wasn't, say, Al Acorn or something or whatever.
Al Alcorn?
Yeah.
Al Acorn.
Al, whatever his name was. But no one ever put down the names of the people who designed it. And same with all the cartridges. Every one of those games was written by one, maybe two people at most, by their design and so forth. But it was just, they were getting a job and Atari takes the credit. Same goes with all the video games in the arcades. Like, we know who made Space Invaders or Taito. But if you went to the arcade game, there is no, hey, designed by this guy, or Pac-Man design. That didn't happen. So therefore, it never entered into the minds of the people at Atari to give credit, because they just said, hey, we're paying your paychecks. Your job is to just make this stuff for us. And then our job is to collect all the money and sleep on it. But it was in time when the programmers realized that they're more like movies stars than they were grunts. Because, like in the movie industry, when they first started, they said, okay, Universal Pictures and so forth made this movie, and they didn't really even credit the people in it. They said, here's this movie, watch the movie, interesting. But it wasn't until the people in the movie realizing people are coming because they like to see me act. Now I am put my name on it, so now XYZ guy is a movie in this movie. That means because you've seen him in previous films, you like it. So now today we have an entire industry both for mostly creative works like books, film, music, in which you're not really following the record label, you're following the artist. Well, now in those years at Atari, they're like, hey, we should be recognized like artists. And hence, that's the reason why when Activision was formed, they then mention all the people's by name, and they even had their photos in there so that now you knew that, oh, I played a game by David Crane. Therefore, if David Crane came up with a new game and I liked his previous game, there's an excellent chance I would like his next game.
Sierra did the same
And
thing. I think, yeah, I have a box over here. And that's one of the things I talked to Ken Williams about. I was like, from the get-go, no matter what, you always made it grossly apparent who was responsible for the product by which you were selling, at least during those years of Sierra before, they were acquired, and, the whole CompuCard scandal that happened at some point. And I was like, and even Al had this ridiculous glamour shot on the back of every single game, every Leisure Suit Larry game he ever did. And I
yeah,
always...
see, while Activision started it, iMagic, but then the big one, EA. When Electronic Arts first was founded back in 82, 83, they were did the whole thing as a record label, in which EA was the label, but you wanted a game by Bill Budge, you wanted by the Ozarks, you wanted by Danny Bunton, etc. And that elevated the people creating the games as actual artists. Hence, the whole name of Electronic Arts was based around publishing artists. So then, and Sierra, when they came into being, they adopted that, saying like, okay, now we've got King's Quest by Roberta Williams. We have Leisure Suit Larry by Al Lowe. We have
Quest for Glory by Corey Cole.
Exactly. And everything was again back to, if the game was really good and you liked the person who created it, then you would want more from that person. And so it just started a whole trend, which is now kind of fading away today. Because I mean, like Call of Duty, who created it? Halo, who created it?
Bungie.
Yeah, Bungie. But then again, while still there are people who did create it, because like even while there's still a large cast of people who created the film, like you do with a movie, there's still people, like the music was done by Marty O'Donnell, the voice of Cortana and so forth. So at least you have some credits. But
yeah, if you sit through the 3-hour credit sequence, you'll be able to see exactly who made the game.
For me, I work behind the scenes. I work behind the camera. So while my name does show up on some games prominently, like Bard's Tale 3 or Dragon Wars, as its creator, I'm on hundreds of games in which I've worked on the game behind the scenes to make the game as good as it is. But unless you either look through Moby Games or go through every single name in the credits of the game, you won't even know what my hand was there.
I'm a huge fan of Moby Games. I frequent that website often. So on my stream, what I do, whenever I do stream, is I play games in the order of release so that I can cognitively see how they've changed as franchises throughout the years, as technology improved. And Moby Games as a repository is one of the best websites ever for
Mhm.
preserving video game history, like period dot. Games you never thought were part of a franchise, you could just look in there and see them, and you're like, oh, okay, cool. It helps me plan, and I may have gone to Moby Games before this interview too. I think I maybe did it a week ago just to see because to make
Yeah,
my
but
notes.
there's nothing wrong with it because Moby Games exists as a good resource. So I mean, like what's hilarious is that for me was when I won the tournament in 1980, it was a big deal for about 2 years, and then the video game crash occurred. And it was kind of like the equivalent of a nuclear war when it came to video game history, because once the crash finished, a lot of people thought that was the end of the video game industry. We're done. But it wasn't until years later, a couple of years later, when Nintendo managed to bring back the video game industry through the Nintendo 8-bit. And then they themselves had a contest for, I think, Link, and then there was another one for Donkey Kong, and so a lot of people thought that was the first video game tournament because all the history had been erased before Nintendo. So, oh yeah, there were Atari games. Oh yeah, there was an Intellivision game. Yeah, there's Coleco, but that's all we know. It's like, no, but you also had contests. You had movies. You even had a TV show that used the Fairchild Channel F called POW. And, but people barely remember that. And it's only until in the last decade where historians are going there actually digging up all this stuff, finding the old tapes and things, saying, like, what the heck is this? Oh, yeah, that actually existed. Oh, there was a contest from Atari. Oh, there was this. History didn't start in 1986. It actually started back in 72. So, you know, yeah, we're Magaball Odyssey, Space War, Pong. You got it.
I you mentioned the tournaments. I can just see like a bunch of extremely stressed out nerds at MIT going into a basement to play on a PDP-10, waiting to get everything configured to play, Space War for 5 minutes. But I always found Space War so interesting because that's what Nolan Bushnell took the base work for. I think it's computer space.
Yeah, it's computer space and stuff like that. But you get the point. Is that somebody came with a game idea because they were bored. They started playing it. They had fun. They even had contests. But then somebody said, "Hey, maybe this can be an actual commercial product," and then they became a commercial product. And one thing led to another. We went from Pong in the early '70s to photorealistic games that pretty much looked like live action movies here in the 2020s. That's like 50 years. Just imagine what's going to be like 50 years from now.
Microchip games in our brain. Hopefully, like just lay
The
down in bed and
Matrix.
never have to get up.
Yeah.
We'll see. Anyway, I was interested. How did you go about meeting Brian Fargo and the other founding members of Interplay?
Okay, that's an interesting story. When I was working back east in Towson, Maryland with Avalon Hill, eventually I attracted the interest of some technical recruiters who said, Time Warner wants to recruit you to work on a play cable system. And they were offering me actual money. Whereas, I was getting this pitiful amount of money, but says, hey, you're going to pay me, 10 times as much. And I'm like, wow, someone thinks I'm worth that? Cool. So then I relocated to New York City for a while, worked over at the Time Warner building, but it was for HBO. This whole project was HBO, not Time. It wasn't Atari, it wasn't Time Warner, it was HBO. But worked on that, then went to some company in Groton, Harmon, Connecticut called Owl Electronics, where then we worked on the actual prototype of the unit. Then we were notified that the project canceled because they saw that the video game market's getting oversaturated and they feared that there might be a crash. Man, those guys did dodge a bullet. But I then was like, well, I want to move back to LA because I miss living in my original hometown. So I called up an old hacker friend who then said, hey, there's this company called Boone that they're hiring people. Maybe you should go apply there. So I then fly back to Southern California, um, go up to my mom and say, hey, you got a room for me for a couple of days or weeks? And says, sure. I then go interview at Boone, and they said, oh, the Atari 2600. We got a contract we've never been able to take because we wanted to take these Zonix KTEL 2600 games and port them to the VIC-20. And you're the perfect person for it. And that the person who hired me was Brian Fargo. Because Yep, because what had happened was that he himself was working on he did this adventure game called Demon's Forge and packaged it himself, so and selling it door to door, but then he attracted the attention of Mike Boone, who then, hired him and kind of like I don't know if they acquired, but that's something Brian can tell you for the details. But long story short, Brian was in charge of product development at Boone because of this. And then he was the one who's like hiring people and so forth. So at the recommendation of my friend, who also was a contractor at Boone, I come in, work as a full-time person, and my job was Chuck Norris Super Kicks and Robin Hood, porting them from the Atari 2600 versions to the VIC-20. And then after I did that, then we sent them off to KTEL Zonix, and then I was going to do some C64 ports when the video game crash was just beginning. And then I was doing original C64 games using my own, again, ROM emulator that I designed, and I built them again. So we were using them over at Boone. When one day Mike Boone, the owner, just said, I'm going to sell popsicles to the swap meet instead of doing this, and close down the company. So we're all sitting at the table going like, well, we're unemployed. What now? And we were like, well, maybe we should make our own video game company. I mean, we've got everything we need. And that's how Interplay was born. Yeah, go back in the higher market or say, fuck it, let's just go ahead and make a video game studio because we already have it. So Jay Patel, Troy Royal, myself, and Brian immediately became the core of Interplay. Troy Miles, Alan Pavlish, and I think that was it. Just Troy Miles and Alan Pavlish. Troy Miles didn't join us immediately, and Alan Pavlish was always a contractor. He was never an employee of Boone, at least as far as I know. Again, ask Alan for those specifics. But then eventually, in time, Alan and Troy Miles joined up Interplay.
And so, did you ever play Bard's Tale before actually like doing number 3?
I wrote Bard's Tale 1 and 2. So, I mean, I worked all the engine, the tools, the graphic engines, the scenario for the Apple II, that was Mike Cranford. So go to Mike Cranford for the star. And the concept is Mike Cranford. He was the one who came up with it. Now, I played Wizardry, and I played Wizardry 1, 2, and 3. I enjoyed it, and I was even campaigning we should do our own Wizardry game. But then Michael Cranford, who was an old high school buddy of Brian Fargo, came in saying, like, hey, I already did this game for Hess. I want to do a sequel. And Wizardry is cool. Let's see what we could do as a better Wizardry. But, he wanted to basically have Interplay use its resources to generate the art and tools and things for him while he just made the scenario and the story. And an agreement was entered, and that's what happened. Mike Cranford, was working either at home, but sometimes he was working at the office, and I make the art tools, the sound tools, and stuff. I know that guy Lawrence Holland, I think his name. Don't quote me on that, but I know that somebody else, another friend of Mike Cranford, composed the music on the game. But and then the game shipped, and then once the game shipped, I was in charge of taking the code base and putting it on other platforms, most notably with the Apple II GS. And when I looked at the code, I'm going like, holy hell, the scenario code. So I threw it all out and rewrote it completely in a scripting language and stuff. And that's the basis of the Apple II GS versions. And then later on, when Bard's Tale 2 was done, I did the same thing to it and updated my engine to handle Bard's Tale 2 and all the extra features in it. And then when Cranford had a parting of the ways with Interplay, and that's saying kindly. Well, the franchise was kind of dying because Bard's Tale 2 was nowhere near as well received as Bard's Tale 1. So, and of course, Interplay was having this obsession about the new game called Fallout. Not Fallout, Wasteland. It was called Wasteland at the time. So they were putting all their eggs in that basket, thinking that's going to be the new franchise that's going to move us forward. And I said, I want to do Bard's Tale 3. And they're like, what makes you think you can do Bard's Tale? I wrote the freaking Bard's Tale 1 and 2, and it's with this new engine that I wrote. I can easily throw together a Bard's Tale 3. So they gave me a minimal budget, just 4 of us, literally 4 people. Whereas Wasteland were like over a dozen, about a dozen. And the 4 of us made Bard's Tale 3. And I personally did the conversions for other platforms like the C64, and then we did basis for the Windows version, not DOS version, and I even did a 2GS version, but never got released because that was when the market for the 2GS was dying. But then after that was done, I immediately started working on what was supposed to be Bard's Tale 4, but due to a thing that had nothing to do with me, was that Interplay wanted to be its own publisher, and we were doing a game called Battle Chess and Neuromancer. Now, Neuromancer was the game supposed to put us on the map because it's based on a movie that never came out. And we needed to be a publisher, we needed a distribution deal. Electronic Arts is saying, well, we've already been publishing your games for you. Why don't you have us as your distributor? And Activision, under the name Mediagenic, came in and says, hey, we got a better deal because they want to take us away from EA. So we signed with Mediagenic / Activision, to which EA said, you're going to do that? Well, then screw you. No Wasteland 2, no Bard's Tale 4. We're going to take those trademarks and keep them from us, keep them from Interplay. And so it's like, well, I can't call this Bard's Tale 4, so we will. I remember it was called War of the Dragons, and it was called Project X, and so forth. I had all my stuff listed as Bard's Tale 4. Even now, when I look at my source code, it still has references to the name Bard's Tale 4, because when you play the game, it's like, gee, it looks an awful lot like Bard's Tale. But of course, new art, new story, new stuff like that, because trademarks.
And that's it for the first half of this episode. The second half should be out now, or at the latest tomorrow. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.